Yes people, how's it going? Nox Gamer's favourite console, the Sega Saturn, turned 30 years old this week, so I thought it'd be a great time to sit down and talk about my favourite memories of the Sega Saturn, because it is probably my favourite console next to the Sega Dreamcast, because I was an absolute Sega nut growing up. I remember back in the middle of 1995, so to me the Saturn's still 29 years old, because it was released in Japan a year before it came out in the UK. I think it came out in the UK in June 1995. So not long after that, at the July of that year, I got my Sega Saturn. I remember my dad going to, I think it was Tandy or Electronics Boutique or something like that, and they bought the last system that they had. Unfortunately, my Saturn was my first Saturn was an X-Display model, because that's all they had left in the shop. And on my birthday, when I received it, I opened it, I was really excited. With the system, I got Daytona USA, Panzer Dragoon, and Virtua Fighter, I remember at the time. And Panzer Dragoon absolutely blew me away. By the time I got to the second stage, this Saturn just started resetting at random. Like, every time I put a game in, one of these three games, it just would not play it. Virtua Fighter played without the music, the graphics wouldn't load up properly, and obviously the build-up to this system coming out, being such a Sega fan when I was younger, I was absolutely gutted, because at the time, what happened was I traded in my Super Nintendo to get half of the money towards this Sega Saturn, so I got rid of a phenomenally big Super Nintendo collection at the time, and I was big into my JRPGs, so I had stuff like Secret of Mana, Terranigma, and some of the really big hitting RPGs for the SNES, and I got rid of that all towards my Sega Saturn, and I didn't regret it at the time, and I still don't regret it to this day. The only game I regret getting rid of was Terranigma, because the price of that game is absolutely phenomenal now. But anyway, after the end of the first day, I was quite upset with the fact that we couldn't get through a race on Daytona, me and my dad together, without the system resetting, without the music jumping, without the graphics corrupting. So we went back to the shop, and I had to wait a few days for them to get a new Saturn in. And once they did, that was it, people. I dived straight into Panzer Dragoon, and that game just blew me away at the time. Bearing in mind we were only just moving away from sprite-based 2D games, and our only real taste of 3D that we'd had on consoles at the time was either Virtua Racing on the Sega Mega Drive and Genesis, or Stunt Race FX and Starwing on the Super Nintendo. So 3D was all new and shiny to us at the time, and I remember the main reason I wanted a Sega Saturn was from frequent trips to places like Skegness and Inglemells growing up. We used to always go to the arcades there, and come on people, Sega were the king of the arcade. You couldn't go past an arcade without a Daytona USA machine roaring at you, or Sega Touring Car or something like that. So their arcade presence in the UK in the 90s alone was massive, and that influenced me heavily towards Sega's stuff. Obviously it all played out rather differently when the PlayStation sort of cleaned up, but I was still a Sega fan at heart, and I carried on with my Sega Saturn. Even though at school people were saying, oh, I'm playing Final Fantasy on the PlayStation, it's amazing, I'm playing this, that and the other, I was content to sit at home with my Sega Saturn and play Shining the Holy Ark, which is one of the greatest RPGs I've ever played. So all I want to do here is just go briefly through a few of my favourite Sega Saturn games. You know, those games that really leave an imprint on you when you're younger. The games that you could return back to later in life and just play with your eyes closed because you played them so much at the time. So here we go, let's have a look at a few of Nox Gamer's favourite Sega Saturn games. Everybody else has this game in their list, but this game has a particular meaning for me. Daytona USA on the Sega Saturn is probably the reason I convinced my parents to buy me the system. It was that arcade machine that I used to always play with my dad. Every time we went on holiday when I was younger, we were sitting in an arcade and we played Daytona USA. We tried to get as many people on the 8-player machine as we could, and the fond memories of playing that in my youth. And then when we got the Sega Saturn, sitting around the TV with my dad playing a game again with the steering wheel, is just a memory that's going to stay with me forever. And though Daytona USA's original port lacked graphical polish and was a little janky in the frame rate department, the gameplay from the arcade came through perfectly well for the Sega Saturn. It played exactly like the arcade game. It is still to this day a beautiful game to play. You just have to look past the graphics, people. Graphics aren't everything in a game, and I know at the time it was up against Ridge Racer on the PlayStation, which looked fluid and also was a beautiful game, don't get me wrong, I'm not comparing the two. But Daytona USA is one of those games that has a special place in my heart because because of the memories attached to it, and all the holiday memories from playing the games in the arcade with my dad and my sister and my family. It really is probably one of the most impactful games I've ever played, and I don't think I could ever live without Daytona USA. So yes, that is in my top Sega Saturn games. A very good reason for it too. Another one of my absolute favourite Saturn games is Fighters Mega Mix. Now, this game is often considered to be one of the best 3D fighting games of that generation, and I wouldn't disagree with that. Fighters Mega Mix has a massive roster of characters from both Virtua Fighter and Fighting Vipers. There's even plenty of hidden characters on the main select screen there for you to unlock. By completing the game's various courses, you can unlock crazy things like the Daytona USA car, Jane from Virtua Cop, Rent-A-Hero, and even Seba, which was an unused character from the original Virtua Fighter game. Put short, Fighters Mega Mix just has absolutely bucket loads of extra content, millions of reasons for you to come back and keep playing, and some of the best two-player fighting action that me and my mates enjoyed during the 90s. Honestly, I can't recommend this game any higher. Fighters Mega Mix is the best 3D fighting game on the Saturn, and an essential game for anyone wanting to collect for the system. I'm probably going over all the games that everybody else will cover in their Sega Saturn tops, but Panzer Dragoon 2 has to be possibly one of my favourite games on the machine. I mean, the first game, when I remember sitting down on my Sega Saturn when I first got it and playing that first game, and the first game absolutely blew me away. So when Panzer Dragoon 2 was released, the game just, it upped the ante so much over the original. The frame rate was improved, the graphics were improved, the game introduced different routes you could take depending on what kill ratio you got, what you'd missed, and you could just evolve your dragon in so many different ways depending on the route you took through the game at the time, that it just added, again, like with a lot of these Sega games, so much replay value. You just wanted to go back again and again and again to check that different route to see if you could get that different dragon evolution. And finally, once you've managed to get the correct route, you get the final evolution at the end of the game, which will give you the dragon from the first game to take down the boss, and that will give you the true ending. But on completing Panzer Dragoon so many times, you also open a feature called Pandora's Box, which lets you tweak many options in the game. Again, added even more replayability value to this. And I think what pulled me back to Panzer Dragoon 2 so much was that urge to beat the shoot-down ratio on every level, to get that 100% on each stage. You just had to push yourself and remember where the enemy spawns came from. Eventually you just know the game inside out. It is such an absolute beautiful masterpiece of a game, with one of the best soundtracks I've ever heard in a video game ever, and some of the most cinematic set pieces you'll ever see in an on-rail shooter. I really can't recommend this game any higher. The next game we have is Exhumed, or Power Slave as it's known outside of Europe. This is a first-person shooter set in Egypt, and after reading rave reviews and previews in Sega Saturn magazine and other publications at the time, I traded loads of games in, rushed to the shops and got myself a copy of Exhumed. And I wasn't disappointed. Exhumed wasn't like many of the first-person shooters around at the time. This is one of the first games that ever forced you to explore previous areas you'd been to once you got new abilities and power-ups in order to progress through the game. For example, in one stage you could find the power to levitate, which will help you revisit an earlier stage in the game and get over a jump you couldn't do, and find an alternate route or a hidden area, or even one of the game's hidden team dolls. Now, to me, that was the game's biggest challenge. Once you'd assembled the radio and unlocked all the stages and abilities, the number one thing you had to do was search for the game's hidden team dolls. There was one hidden in each stage. Most of them were really easy to get once you got the correct abilities, but there was one team doll that was just so infuriating to get, and I bet anybody that's played Exhumed and know exactly which one I'm going to talk about here. And it's the team doll at the end of the laser maze. If anyone's ever played Exhumed, the hardest team doll to find has you levitating through a laser tripwire maze, and if you make one wrong move, you've got to start all over again. I don't mean that part, I mean you've got to start the stage all over again, get all the way to the area where the team doll is, and then try that bit again. It was one of the most infuriating things I've ever done in a video game, but once I'd done it, man, the satisfaction was amazing. After Exhumed, the game's developer went on to produce brilliant conversions of Duke Nukem 3D and Quake for the Sega Saturn. And sadly, I think those were the last two games we ever saw Lobotomy do. But Exhumed is definitely my favourite of the three. So Exhumed looks great, Plays great, has lots of replayability value, especially if you're going for those team dolls, and in my eyes is the best first person shooter on the Sega Saturn. After completing Exhumed, I took it to my local game with a little bit of my paper round money, bearing in mind I was only about 14 at the time, or 15, and I traded it towards what I think is possibly the best game on the Sega Saturn. It's difficult to put any other game above this. It's the fantastic Nights into Dreams by Sonic Team. Now, this game is very chalk and cheese with some people, but for those of us who like high scores and the challenge of beating them repeatedly, Nights is one of those games where you can just go back to it again and again and again. Nights also introduced us to the Sega Saturn 3D controller, which is quintessentially the best way to play this game, as it gives you much more control over Nights as you're spinning around in the air, flipping around, doing tricks, collecting links and getting high scores. So yes, playing it with a standard controller is definitely not recommended. But honestly people, it is my absolute favourite Sega Saturn game, and I return to Christmas Nights every year to try and beat my score on the previous year, which reminds me I better get cracking on with some practice on Christmas Nights in the meantime. But yes, Nights is an essential purchase for any Sega Saturn collector, and in my eyes is the best game on the system. So when I was about 17, I traded in my Sega Saturn along with a lot of my PAL games for a chipped machine. And now the chip machine I got was a weird setup. It had a clock counter on the inside of the cartridge slot at the back of the system, and you had to press a dip switch to change the system from region to region. And the counter went from 0 to 9, and there was only 3 regions: PAL set to 0, American NTSC set to 1, and NTSC Japanese set to 2. The problem we had was with the first Japanese import game I got, which was the awesome X-Men vs Street Fighter. Now, me and my friends were heavily into our 2D beat-em-ups, and the Sega Saturn's Japanese library is chock full of amazing ones, people. But the problem arose when I put the 4MB RAM cartridge from X-Men vs Street Fighter into my Saturn, and every time I pushed it into the cartridge slot, it would press the region switch and click the region, which was incredibly frustrating. So before you played any 4MB RAM cart Japanese games, so I had to set the clock on my Saturn to 1, which was NTSC America. So when I put the 4MB cartridge in, it then clicked the switch and switched the region to Japanese. It was a crude setup, and I think it was done to systems before the 4MB RAM cartridge really came in. So yeah, that was the only gripe. I had to set it to the wrong region to then put the cartridge in to change the region, which was quite odd. But once you'd done that, X-Men vs Street Fighter was possibly one of the most arcade perfect ports I'd seen to a 32-bit system at the time. It just hyped up Street Fighter beyond, giving you massive jumps, the ability to tag, crazy screen filling super moves. It was just so much eye candy, and to me and my friends at the time who were heavily into 2D beat-em-ups, that was the one we all really sunk our teeth into once I dipped into the Japanese library. We then moved on to games like Marvel Super Heroes vs Street Fighter, which was more of the same, just amped up even more. We also played the fantastic Cyberbots, Vampire Savior, and all manner of Capcom arcade conversions, so that was a massive part of the Japanese library that we missed out on over here. Unless you had a chip system, of course. So 2D beat-em-ups were one of the main reasons I got my system chipped, and yes, Capcom were the king of that for the system. There were also some amazing SNK beat-em-ups on there too. The next 2 imports I remember buying were shoot-em-ups, and honestly the library for shoot-em-ups on the Saturn in Japan is massive. And the first 2 I bought, and this was off the back of reading reviews or previews in Saturn magazines at the time, were Radiant Silvergun and Layer Section 2. Now, I bought these games, I was buying all my imports at the time from a website called Video Game Imports. I'm pretty sure they're still going now, but back then I paid relatively sensible prices for these things still. They were still relatively cheap. But I remember being slightly disappointed by Layer Section 2, only because when I booted it up I felt like I'd played the game before. It wasn't until a few months later I put my finger on it, and I remember being at a friend's house playing the exact same game on his PlayStation, but under the name of Raystorm, because when it was released in the UK it was called Raystorm. Now that series of games is very confusing when you leave Japan because Layer Section 1 was also known as Galactic Attack in the UK, and it did get a PAL release for the Saturn. So disappointments aside, it's a great shoot 'em up for 1 or 2 players. The Saturn version does have some extras over the PlayStation, but I do remember doing a comparison video a year on back, and I just prefer the PlayStation version. It feels more fluid. That's no detriment to the Saturn game, it's still an excellent game in its own right. But when I played Radiant Silvergun, that was it. That was the shoot 'em up, people. I spent so much time on that when I was younger. It was just a fantastic game. I just wished at the time I could have understood the story, because there's a lot of talking before the stages and there's cutscenes in between, but the shooting action is second to none. The finest shoot 'em up on the Sega Saturn, and a must play for anyone. But I do recommend emulating it because the game is rather expensive nowadays. And the quirkiness of the Saturn's Japanese library still piques my interest today. I still regularly buy games for the system. Even though I don't know what some of them are, sometimes I just take a punt, buy the game, and it's something absolutely crazy. But my current obsession in 2024, and hopefully beyond, are the Sega Ages games, especially the Super Scaler games. I remember playing Gale Racer quite a while ago, and it got me thinking, what other games have they done for the system like this? And then I went digging, and I found Power Drift and Galaxy Force 2, and recently I found and also picked up Space Harrier and Outrun. And there's so many of these games on the system that the more I dive in, the more of them I find. And even in 2024, the Saturn is still one of the most interesting systems to collect for. So what are your memories of the Sega Saturn? Do you have a quirky game that sticks out from your childhood that means something to you? Do you have that game that you could go back to and complete today with your eyes shut? Let me know in the comments, guys. So happy 30th anniversary to the Sega Saturn. That doesn't make me feel old at all. I hope you've enjoyed this little trip down memory lane with me and the games that I enjoyed when I was growing up. Thanks for watching, guys. Take care, and we'll see you in the next Sega Saturn video.
Sega Rally Championship.